Esther. Chapter 1. It was in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus whose empire stretched from India to Ethiopia and comprised 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus was sitting on his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet at his court for all his officers of state and ministers, Persian and Median army commanders, nobles and provincial governors. Thus he displayed the riches and splendor of his empire and the pomp and glory of his majesty. The festivities went on for a long time, 180 days. When this period was over, for 7 days the king gave a banquet for all the people living in the citadel of Susa, to high and low alike, on the esplanade in the gardens of the royal palace. There were white and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple thread to silver rings on marble columns, couches of gold and silver on a pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl and precious stones. For drinking there were golden cups of various design and plenty of wine provided by the king with royal liberality. The royal edict did not, however, make drinking obligatory, the king having instructed the officials of his household to treat each guest according to the guest's own wishes. Queen Vashti, for her part, gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Bizthi, Harbona, Bigthi, Abagtha, Zethar and Carcas, the 7 officers in attendance on the person of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, crowned with a royal diadem, in order to display her beauty to the people and the officers of state, since she was very beautiful. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the officers. The king was very angry at this, and his rage grew hot. Addressing himself to the wise men who were versed in the law, it being the practice to refer matters affecting the king to expert lawyers and jurists, he summoned Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marcina and Memucan, 7 Persian and Median officers of state who had privileged access to the royal presence and occupied the leading positions in the kingdom. According to law, he said, what is to be done to Queen Vashti for not obeying the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the officers? In the presence of the king and the officers of state, Memucan replied, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king but also all the officers of state and all the peoples inhabiting the provinces of King Ahasuerus. The queen's conduct will soon become known to all the women, who will adopt a contemptuous attitude towards their own husbands. They will say, King Ahasuerus himself commanded Queen Vashti to appear before him, and she did not come. Before the day is out, the wives of the Persian and Median officers of state will be telling every one of the king's officers of state what they have heard about the queen's behavior, and that will mean contempt and anger all round. If it is the king's pleasure, let him issue a royal edict, to be irrevocably incorporated into the laws of the Persians and Medes, to the effect that Vashti is never to appear again before King Ahasuerus, and let the king confer her royal dignity on a worthier woman. Let this edict issued by the king be proclaimed throughout his empire, which is great, and all the women will henceforth bow to the authority of their husbands, both high and low alike. This speech pleased the king and the officers of state, and the king did as Memucan advised. He sent letters to all the provinces of the kingdom, to each province in its own script and to each nation in its own language, ensuring that every husband should be master in his own house. Esther. Chapter 2. Some time after this, when the king's wrath had subsided, Ahasuerus remembered Vashti, how she had behaved, and the measures taken against her. The king's gentleman-in-waiting said, a search should be made on the king's behalf for beautiful young virgins, and the king appoint commissioners throughout the provinces of his realm to bring all these beautiful young virgins to the citadel of Susa, to the harem under the authority of Haggai the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. Here he will give them whatever they need for enhancing their beauty, and the girl who pleases the king can take Vashti's place as queen. This advice pleased the king, and he acted on it. Now in the citadel of Susa there lived a Jew called Mordecai son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who had been deported from Jerusalem among the captives taken away with Jeconiah king of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon, and was now bringing up a certain Hadassah, otherwise called Esther, his uncle's daughter, who had lost both father and mother. The girl had a good figure and a beautiful face, and on the death of her parents Mordecai had adopted her as his daughter. On the promulgation of the royal command and edict, a great number of girls were brought to the citadel of Susa, where they were entrusted to Haggai. Esther, too, was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, the custodian of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Not only did he quickly provide her with all she needed for her dressing room and her meals, but he gave her 7 special maids from the king's household and transferred her and her maids to the best part of the harem. Esther had not divulged her race or parentage, since Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Mordecai walked up and down in front of the courtyard of the harem all day and every day, to learn how Esther was and how she was being treated. Each girl had to appear in turn before King Ahasuerus after a delay of 12 months fixed by the regulations for the women. This preparatory period was occupied as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and lotions commonly used for feminine beauty treatment. When each girl went to the king, she was given whatever she wanted to take with her, since she then moved from the harem into the royal household. She went there in the evening, and the following morning returned to another harem entrusted to the care of Shashgaz, the king's officer, custodian of the concubines. She did not go to the king any more, unless he was particularly pleased with her and had her summoned by name. But when it was the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, whose nephew Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king's presence, she did not ask for anything beyond what had been assigned her by Haggai, the king's officer, custodian of the women. Esther won the approval of all who saw her. She was brought to King Ahasuerus in his royal apartments in the 10th month, which is called Tevath, in the 7th year of his reign, and the king liked Esther better than any of the other women. None of the other girls found so much favor and approval with him. So he set the royal diadem on her head and proclaimed her queen instead of Vashti. The king then gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his officers of state and ministers, decreed a holiday for all the provinces, and distributed largesse with royal prodigality. When Esther, like the other girls, had been transferred to the second harem, she did not divulge her parentage or race, in obedience to the orders of Mordecai, whose instructions she continued to follow as when she had been under his care. At this time Mordecai was attached to the chancellery, and 2 malcontents, Bigthan and Teresh, officers in the king's service as guards of the threshold, plotted to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Mordecai came to hear of this and informed Queen Esther, who in turn, on Mordecai's authority, told the king. The matter was investigated and proved to be true. The 2 conspirators were sent to the gallows, and the incident was recorded in the annals, in the royal presence. Esther, chapter 3. Shortly afterwards, King Ahasuerus singled out Haman son of Hammedatha, a native of Agag, for promotion. He raised him in rank, granting him precedence over all his colleagues, the other officers of state, and all the royal officials employed at the chancellery used to bow low and prostrate themselves whenever Haman appeared. Such was the king's command. Mordecai refused either to bow or to prostrate himself. "Why do you flout the royal command?" the officials of the chancellery asked Mordecai. Day after day they asked him this, but he took no notice of them. In the end they reported the matter to Haman, to see whether Mordecai would persist in his attitude, since he had told them that he was a Jew. Haman could see for himself that Mordecai did not bow or prostrate himself in his presence. He became furiously angry, and on being told what race Mordecai belonged to, he thought it beneath him merely to get rid of Mordecai, but made up his mind to wipe out all the members of Mordecai's race, the Jews, living in Ahasuerus' entire empire. In the 1st month, that is the month of Nisan, of the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in Haman's presence, to determine the day and the month. The lot falling on the 12th month, which is Adar, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There is a certain unassimilated nation scattered among the other nations throughout the provinces of your realm. Their laws are different from those of all the other nations, and the royal laws they ignore. Hence it is not in the king's interests to tolerate them, if their destruction be signed. So please the king, I am ready to pay 10,000 talents of silver to the king's receivers, to be credited to the royal treasury. The king then took his signet ring off his hand and gave it to Haman son of Hammedatha, the persecutor of the Jews. Keep the money, he said, and you can have the people too. Do what you like with them. The royal scribes were therefore summoned for the 13th day of the first month, when they wrote out the orders addressed by Haman to the king's satraps, to the governors ruling each province and to the principal officials of each people, to each province in its own script and to each people in its own language. The edict was signed in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with his ring, and letters were sent by runners to every province of the realm, ordering the destruction, slaughter and annihilation of all Jews, young and old, including women and children, on the same day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar, and the seizing of their possessions. Copies of this decree, to be promulgated as law in each province, were published to the various peoples, so that each might be ready for the day aforementioned. At the king's command, the runners set out with all speed. The decree was first promulgated in the citadel of Susa. While the king and Haman gave themselves up to feasting and drinking, consternation reigned in the city of Susa. Esther, chapter 4. When Mordecai learned what had happened, he tore his garments and put on sackcloth and ashes. Then he walked into the center of the city, wailing loudly and bitterly, until he arrived in front of the chancellery, which no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter. And in every province, no sooner had the royal command and edict arrived, than among the Jews there was great mourning, fasting, weeping and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. When Queen Esther's maids and officers came and told her, she was overcome with grief. She sent clothes for Mordecai to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he refused them. Esther then summoned Hathach, an officer whom the king had appointed to wait on her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and inquire what the matter was and why he was acting in this way. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the chancellery, and Mordecai told him what had happened to him personally, and also about the sum of money which Haman had offered to pay into the royal treasury to procure the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the Edict of Extermination published in Susa for him to show Esther for her information, with a message that she was to go to the king and implore his favor and plead with him for the race to which she belonged. Hathach came back and told Esther what Mordecai had said, and she replied with the following message for Mordecai. Royal officials and people living in the provinces alike all know that for anyone, man or woman, who approaches the king in the private apartments without having been summoned there is only one law. He must die, unless the king, by pointing his golden scepter towards him, grants him his life. And I have not been summoned to the king for the last 30 days. These words of Esther were reported to Mordecai, who sent back the following reply. Do not suppose that, because you are in the king's palace, you are going to be the one Jew to escape. No, if you persist in remaining silent at such a time, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, but both you and your father's whole family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to the throne for just such a time as this. Whereupon Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go and assemble all the Jews now in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink day or night for 3 days. For my part, I and my waiting women shall keep the same fast, after which I shall go to the king in spite of the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai went away and carried out Esther's instructions. Esther, chapter 5. On the 3rd day, when she had finished praying, she took off her suppliant's mourning attire and dressed herself in her full splendor. Radiant as she then appeared, she invoked God who watches over all people and saves them. With her, she took 2 ladies in waiting. With a delicate air she leaned on one, while the other accompanied her carrying her train. rosy with the full flush of her beauty. Her face radiated joy and love, but her heart shrank with fear. Having passed through door after door, she found herself in the presence of the king. He was sitting on his royal throne, dressed in all his robes of state, glittering with gold and precious stones, a formidable sight. He looked up, afire with majesty and, blazing with anger, saw her. The queen sank to the floor. As she fainted, the color drained from her face and her head fell against the lady-in-waiting beside her. But God changed the king's heart, inducing a milder spirit. He sprang from his throne in alarm and took her in his arms until she recovered, comforting her with soothing words. "What is the matter, Esther?" he said. "I am your brother. Take heart, you are not going to die. Our order applies only to ordinary people. Come to me." "Sire," she said, "to me you looked like one of God's angels, and my heart was moved with fear of your majesty. For you are a figure of wonder, my lord, and your face is full of graciousness." But as she spoke, she fell down in a faint. The king grew more agitated, and his courtiers all set about reviving her. "What is the matter, Queen Esther?" the king said. "Tell me what you want. Even if it is half my kingdom, I grant it you." "Would it please the king," Esther replied, "to come with Haman today to the banquet I have prepared for him?" The king said, "Tell Haman to come at once, so that Esther may have her wish." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared, and, during the banquet, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me your request. I grant it to you. Tell me what you want. Even if it is half my kingdom, it is yours for the asking." "What do I want? What is my request?" Esther replied, "If I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it is his pleasure to grant what I ask and to agree to my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet I intend to give them tomorrow, and then I shall do as the king says." Haman left full of joy and high spirits that day. But when he saw Mordecai at the chancellery, neither standing up nor stirring at his approach, he felt a gust of anger. He restrained himself, however. Returning home, he sent for his friends and Zeresh's wife and held forth to them about his dazzling wealth, his many children, how the king had raised him to a position of honor and promoted him over the heads of the king's officers of state and ministers. "What is more," he added, "Queen Esther has just invited me and the king, no one else except me, to a banquet she was giving, and better still, she has invited me and the king again tomorrow. But what do I care about all this when all the while I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the chancellery?" "Have a 50-cubit gallows run up," said Zeresh's wife and all his friends, "and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then you can go with the king to the banquet, without a care in the world." Delighted with this advice, Haman had the gallows erected. Esther, chapter 6. That night the king could not sleep. He called for the record book, or annals, to be brought and read to him. They contained an account of how Mordecai had denounced Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs serving as guards of the threshold, who had plotted to assassinate King Ahasuerus. "And what honor and dignity," the king asked, "was conferred on Mordecai for this?" "Nothing has been done for him," the gentleman-in-waiting replied. The king then said, "Who is outside in the antechamber?" Haman had, that very moment, entered the outer antechamber of the private apartments, to ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on the gallows which he had just put up for the purpose. So the king's gentleman-in-waiting replied, "It is Haman out in the antechamber." "Bring him in," the king said, and as soon as Haman came in, went on to ask, "What is the right way to treat a man whom the king wishes to honor?" "Whom," thought Haman, "would the king wish to honor if not me?" So he replied, "If the king wishes to honor someone, royal robes should be brought from the king's wardrobe, and a horse from the king's stable, sporting a royal diadem on its head. The robes and horse should be entrusted to one of the noblest of the king's officers of state, who should then array the man whom the king wishes to honor and lead him on horseback through the city square, proclaiming before him, This is the way a man shall be treated whom the king wished to honor. Hurry, the king said to Haman, take the robes and the horse, and do everything you have just said to Mordecai the Jew, who works at the chancellery. On no account leave out anything that you have mentioned. So taking the robes and the horse, Haman arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square, proclaiming before him, this is the way a man shall be treated whom the king wishes to honor. After this Mordecai returned to the chancellery, while Haman went hurrying home in dejection and covering his face. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had just happened. His wife Zeresh and his friends said, you are beginning to fall, and Mordecai to rise. If he is Jewish, you will never get the better of him. With him against you, your fall is certain. While they were still talking, the king's officers arrived in a hurry to escort Haman to the banquet that Esther was giving. Esther, Chapter 7. The king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and this second day, during the banquet, the king again said to Esther, tell me your request, Queen Esther. I grant it to you. Whatever you want. Even if it is half my kingdom, it is yours for the asking. If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, Queen Esther replied, and if it please your majesty, grant me my life, that is my request, and the lives of my people, that is what I want. For we have been handed over, my people and I, to destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. Had we merely been sold as slaves and servant girls, I should not have said anything. But in the present case, it will be beyond the persecutor's means to make good the loss that the king is about to sustain. King Ahasuerus interrupted Queen Esther. Who is this man? He exclaimed. Where is the man who has thought of doing such a thing? Esther replied, the persecutor, the enemy? Why, this wretch Haman. Haman quaked with terror in the presence of the king and queen. In a rage, the king got up from the banquet and went into the palace garden, while Haman, realizing that the king was determined on his ruin, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. When the king came back from the palace garden into the banqueting hall, he found Haman sprawled across the couch where Esther was reclining. What? The king exclaimed. Is he going to rape the queen in my own palace? The words were scarcely out of his mouth than a veil was thrown over Haman's face. In the royal presence, Harbona, one of the officers, said, there is that 50-cubit gallows, too, which Haman ran up for Mordecai, who spoke up to the king's great advantage. It is all ready at his house. Hang him on it, said the king. So Haman was hanged on the gallows which he had erected for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. Esther, Chapter 8. That same day King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the persecutor of the Jews. Mordecai was presented to the king, Esther having revealed their mutual relationship. The king, who had recovered his signet ring from Haman, took it off and gave it to Mordecai, while Esther gave Mordecai charge of Haman's house. Esther again went to speak to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and imploring his favor, to frustrate the malice that Haman the Agagite had been plotting against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to her, whereupon Esther stood up and faced him. If such is the king's good pleasure, she said, and if I have found favor before him, if my petition seems proper to him, and if I myself am pleasing to his eyes, may he be pleased to issue a written revocation of the letters which Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, has had written, ordering the destruction of the Jews throughout the royal provinces. For how can I look on, while my people suffer what is proposed for them? How can I bear to witness the extermination of my relatives? King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, I for my part have given Esther Haman's house, and have had him hanged on the gallows for planning to destroy the Jews. You, for your part, write what you please as regards the Jews, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet. For any edict written in the king's name and sealed with his signet is irrevocable. The royal scribes were summoned at once. It was the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and at Mordecai's dictation an order was written to the Jews, the satraps, governors and principal officials of the provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each provinces in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. These letters, written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet, were carried by couriers mounted on horses from the king's own stud farms. In them the king granted the Jews, in whatever city they lived, the right to assemble in self-defense, with permission to destroy, slaughter and annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, together with their women and children, and to plunder their possessions, with effect from the same day throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is Adar. Copies of this edict, to be promulgated as law in each province, were published to the various peoples, so that the Jews could be ready on the day stated to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, mounted on the king's horses, set out in great haste and urgency at the king's command. The edict was also published in the citadel of Susa. Mordecai left the royal presence in a princely gown of violet and white, with a great golden crown and a cloak of fine linen and purple. The city of Susa shouted for joy. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and decree arrived, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and holiday-making. Of the country's population many became Jews, since now the Jews were feared. Esther, chapter 9. The king's command and decree came into force on the 13th day of the 12th month, Adar, and the day on which the enemies of the Jews had hoped to crush them produced the very opposite effect. The Jews it was who crushed their enemies. In their towns throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the Jews assembled to strike at those who had planned to injure them. No one resisted them, since the various peoples were now all afraid of them. Provincial officers of state, satraps, governors and royal officials, all supported the Jews for fear of Mordecai. And indeed Mordecai was a power in the palace and his fame was spreading through all the provinces. Mordecai was steadily growing more powerful. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, with resulting slaughter and destruction, and worked their will on their opponents. In the citadel of Susa alone, the Jews put to death and slaughtered 500 men, notably Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashtha, Arisai, Aridai and Jezatha, the 10 sons of Haman son of Hammedatha, the persecutor of the Jews. But they took no plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "In the citadel of Susa the Jews have killed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman. What must they have done in the other provinces of the realm? Tell me your request. I grant it to you. Tell me what else you would like. It is yours for the asking." "If such is the king's pleasure," Esther replied, "let the Jews of Susa be allowed to enforce today's decree tomorrow as well. And as for the 10 sons of Haman, let their bodies be hanged on the gallows." Whereupon, the king having given the order, the edict was promulgated in Susa and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. Thus the Jews of Susa reassembled on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in the city. But they took no plunder. The other Jews who lived in the king's provinces also assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies. They slaughtered 75,000 of their opponents. But they took no plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. On the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But for the Jews of Susa, who had assembled on the 13th and 14th days, the 15th was the day they rested, making that a day of feasting and gladness. This is why Jewish country people, those who live in undefended villages, keep the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of gladness, feasting and holiday-making, and the exchanging of presents with one another. Whereas for those who live in cities the day of rejoicing and exchanging presents with their neighbors is the 15th day of Adar. Mordecai committed these events to writing. Then he sent letters to all the Jews living in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them to celebrate the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar every year, as the days on which the Jews had rid themselves of their enemies, and the month in which their sorrow had been turned into gladness, and mourning into a holiday. He therefore told them to keep these as days of festivity and gladness when they were to exchange presents and make gifts to the poor. Once having begun, the Jews continued observing these practices, Mordecai having written them an account of how Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the persecutor of all the Jews, had plotted their destruction and had cast the that is, the lot, for their overthrow and ruin. But how, when he went back to the king to ask him to order the hanging of Mordecai, the wicked scheme which he had devised against the Jews recoiled on his own head, and both he and his sons were hanged on the gallows. And that, hence, these days were called Purim, from the word pur. And so, because of what was written in this letter, and because of what they had seen for themselves and of what had happened to them, the Jews willingly bound themselves, their descendants and all who should join them, to celebrate these 2 days without fail, in the manner prescribed and at the time appointed, year after year. Thus commemorated and celebrated from generation to generation, in every family, in every province, in every city, these days of Purim will never be abrogated among the Jews, nor will their memory perish from their race. Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, wrote with full authority to ratify the second letter, and sent letters to all the Jews of the 127 provinces of the realm of Ahasuerus, in terms of peace and loyalty, enjoining them to observe these days of Purim at the appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew had recommended, and in the manner prescribed for themselves and their descendants, with additional ordinances for fasts and lamentations. The ordinance of Esther fixed the law of Purim, which was then recorded in a book. Esther, chapter 10. King Ahasuerus put not only the mainland under tribute but the Mediterranean islands as well. All his feats of power and valor, and the account of the high honor to which he raised Mordecai, all this is recorded in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia. And Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to King Ahasuerus. He was a man held in respect among the Jews, esteemed by thousands of his brothers, a man who sought the good of his people and cared for the welfare of his entire race.